For over 2 centuries, the Rothschild family has controlled more wealth than most nations. Kings trusted them. Governments depended on them. For many people, the scale of the Rothschilds' power was difficult to explain. How could one family build and maintain influence across entire continents for so long? Over time, different theories started appearing. Claims about hidden bloodlines, secret experiments, even rumors that the family itself is connected to reptilian origins. Most of those ideas were dismissed as exaggeration, but when historians started looking at the family's own records, things became far more complicated. Between 1824 and 1877, around 70% of marriages within key branches of the Rothschild family were between blood relatives, most of them first cousins. Now, marriages between relatives weren't unusual among European elites at the time. But what stood out here wasn't that it happened. It was how often it happened and why. And the more researchers looked into it, the more it stopped looking like tradition and started looking like a pattern. But mapping that pattern isn't as simple as it sounds. Parts of the family tree don't line up, some records are incomplete, and certain names seem to vanish from the historical trail altogether. That's why today we're cutting through centuries of secrecy to answer one question: what is the genetic secret of the most powerful family in the world? The pattern in the family records. Historians who study the Rothschild family archives often begin with something simple: the family tree. At first glance, it looks like any other aristocratic genealogy from Europe. Names stretch across generations, connecting branches of a dynasty that helped shape finance and politics for more than 2 centuries. But when researchers started examining these records more carefully, something unusual began to appear. The same names kept returning again and again. Sons named after fathers, daughters carrying the names of aunts and grandmothers. That alone was not strange, since many traditional families repeated names across generations. What caught the attention of historians was how often those names were connected through marriage. Marriage records preserved in family documents showed a recurring pattern. Cousins were marrying cousins. Close relatives were forming new family branches that were still tied to the same shared grandparents. At first, these connections seemed occasional, the kind of marriages that sometimes happened in aristocratic circles where social circles were small. But as researchers continued mapping the family tree, the pattern became far more consistent than anyone expected. Instead of spreading outward into many unrelated families, certain branches of the Rothschild lineage seemed to bend inward. Genealogical charts showed the same surnames linking together again across decades. Lines that should have been separated began to reconnect through marriage agreements. Over time, the family tree looked less like a wide network and more like a carefully connected structure. Then historians noticed another detail that added to the mystery. Some individuals appeared briefly in correspondence or genealogical notes, but then seemed to disappear from later records. A name might appear in a family letter or a marriage announcement, yet later documents did not always follow their lives in the same way as other relatives were documented. These gaps were small, but they appeared often enough to raise questions among researchers who were trying to understand the full structure of the dynasty. As more family records from different cities were compared, the pattern became clearer. The Rothschild network stretched across major European capitals, including London, Paris, Vienna, Frankfurt, and Naples. Even though these branches operated in different countries, the family maintained remarkably close internal connections. Marriage alliances repeatedly brought relatives from these cities back together into the same bloodline. But why would one of the most powerful financial dynasties in Europe organize its family relationships in such a tightly controlled way? Wealthy families often married within their social class, but the Rothschild pattern appeared more systematic than simple tradition. Researchers eventually realized that the pattern they were seeing was not accidental. And this pattern did not begin by accident. It started with a set of rules created by the man who founded the entire Rothschild dynasty, The founder's strategy. The story of the Rothschild dynasty begins in the city of Frankfurt, in a narrow district that once served as the center of the Jewish community. It was here that Mayer Amschel Rothschild began building what would later become one of the most influential financial networks in European history. He started as a dealer in rare coins and gradually developed relationships with wealthy collectors and regional rulers. Through these connections, he gained the trust of powerful clients who needed reliable financial services, including the management of large sums of money and the movement of funds across different territories. As his business grew, Mayer Amschel realized that the future of the family enterprise could not remain limited to one city. Europe at that time was made up of many kingdoms and states, each with its own rules for trade, finance, and taxation. Moving money safely across borders was difficult, slow, and often dangerous. Merchants and governments needed partners they could trust to handle financial transactions between cities that were sometimes hundreds of miles apart. To solve this problem, Mayer Amschel developed a strategy that was unusual for its time. Instead of relying on distant business partners, he decided that the most reliable partners would be members of his own family. He began preparing his sons to take active roles in the expanding enterprise. Each son would eventually move to a different European city and establish a branch of the family banking business there. Over time, the plan unfolded across the continent. Frankfurt remained the original center of the family operations, but new branches appeared in London, Paris, Vienna, and Naples. Each city represented an important financial hub within Europe, and placing family members in these locations allowed the Rothschild network to operate across national borders with remarkable speed and coordination. The brothers managed their own offices and worked with local governments, merchants, and investors, but they never operated in isolation. They remained closely connected to one another through letters, messengers, and financial reports. Information about markets, political changes, and business opportunities traveled constantly between the family branches. This network allowed them to move capital from one country to another in ways that were far more efficient than traditional banking systems. When governments needed loans, when merchants required large transfers of money, or when investors wanted to fund major projects, the Rothschild network could respond quickly because each branch trusted the others completely. Money could be arranged in London, confirmed in Frankfurt, and delivered in Vienna without relying on outside intermediaries. This gave the family a level of coordination that few financial institutions could match. The success of this system depended on one critical factor above all others: trust within the family itself. Every major decision required confidence that each branch would protect the interests of the entire network. If an outsider gained influence within the system, the flow of information and capital could be disrupted, and the structure that connected the family's financial power across Europe might weaken. Because of this risk, Mayer Amschel believed that the strongest protection for the family business was unity within the family itself. His strategy was not limited to banking practices or business agreements. It also extended to the personal lives of his descendants. In order to keep wealth concentrated within the dynasty and maintain loyalty between branches, family marriages gradually began to follow carefully controlled patterns. Relatives were encouraged to marry within the extended family circle rather than forming alliances with outsiders who might introduce competing interests. These marriages helped ensure that wealth remained within the same network that controlled the banking houses across Europe. They also reinforced personal bonds between the different branches of the dynasty, strengthening the sense that each member was responsible for protecting the same shared enterprise. At first, these internal marriages appeared to be a practical way to maintain unity and control within a rapidly expanding financial empire. However, as the generations passed, the pattern continued with surprising consistency. The family network that connected banks in several European capitals was slowly mirrored by a network of marriages that connected the Rothschild bloodline itself. Over time, those patterns became a policy that shaped the entire Rothschild bloodline. The marriage strategy. As the Rothschild banking network expanded across Europe, the family began paying close attention not only to business alliances, but also to family relationships. The founders of the dynasty understood that financial power could be fragile if control passed into the hands of outsiders. Because of this concern, the Rothschild family gradually adopted a marriage strategy that historians now describe as endogamy, which means marrying within the extended family circle. This approach did not appear suddenly. At first, the Rothschilds formed marriage alliances with other respected families who shared their social position and religious background. However, as the banking empire grew stronger and the family's wealth increased, the dynasty's leadership began to see advantages in keeping marriages even more closely within the family. Instead of forming new alliances with unfamiliar partners, many family members began marrying cousins or other close relatives within the wider Rothschild network. Marriage records preserved in European archives show how frequently these connections occurred. A son from one branch of the family might marry a cousin from another branch who had grown up in a different city. A daughter raised in Paris could later marry a relative connected to the Vienna branch of the dynasty. These marriages were not unusual within aristocratic society, where families often preferred to form alliances within their own social circles. What makes the Rothschild case distinctive is how consistently this pattern continued across multiple generations. The reason behind this strategy was practical and carefully calculated. By arranging marriages within the extended family, the Rothschilds could ensure that wealth, property, and business influence remained concentrated within the dynasty. Large banking fortunes were not divided between unrelated families, and sensitive financial information stayed within a trusted circle of relatives. The result was a financial system that relied on both blood ties and business cooperation. Other aristocratic dynasties in Europe had followed similar approaches in the past. Royal families such as the Habsburgs had also used cousin marriages to strengthen alliances and maintain control of territory and inheritance. Within these dynasties, marriage often served political goals rather than personal ones. The Rothschild family adopted a comparable logic, but they applied it to the world of banking and finance rather than to royal succession or territorial rule.
You are 5 brothers. I want you each to start a banking business in a different country.
What historians find striking is how carefully the Rothschild marriage strategy connected branches of the family that were spread across different countries. The dynasty already operated banking houses in several major European capitals, including Frankfurt, London, Paris, Vienna, and Naples. Through internal marriages, these branches remained closely tied to one another, not only through business partnerships, but also through family bonds. A marriage between relatives in 2 different cities reinforced the connection between the financial institutions they controlled. These marriages created a network that extended far beyond personal relationships. Family gatherings brought together bankers, investors, and political contacts who shared not only financial interests, but also family loyalty. Business decisions could be discussed among relatives who trusted one another deeply, and important information could move through the family network without leaving the circle of the dynasty. Over time, this system formed a powerful combination of family and finance. Wealth stayed within the same group of relatives, and leadership of the banking houses passed from one generation to the next without interference from outside partners. The Rothschilds built a financial structure that depended not only on economic skill, but also on carefully maintained family connections. For outsiders, this structure was difficult to enter. Marriage into the family became rare, and access to the inner workings of the Rothschild network remained limited to those who were already connected by blood. The dynasty had effectively created a closed financial and social system that strengthened both their economic influence and their internal unity. But while the strategy protected their financial empire, it also created consequences that no banking system could control. The hidden cost of a closed bloodline. When historians study powerful European dynasties, they often begin by examining family trees. These records can reveal far more than just names and marriages. Medical historians in particular look closely at patterns of intermarriage because they can sometimes show how certain hereditary conditions appear across generations. When a family repeatedly marries within its own circle, genetic traits may travel through the bloodline in ways that become visible over time. Researchers who analyze aristocratic families from the 19th and early 20th centuries frequently encounter this pattern. In many royal and noble households, marriages between cousins were not unusual. Families believed that such unions helped preserve wealth, land, and political alliances. However, medical science has gradually shown that long-term consanguineous marriage, which means marriage between close relatives, can increase the chances that certain hereditary traits or illnesses will appear more frequently in later generations. As historians began examining correspondence and genealogical material connected to the Rothschild dynasty, some scholars noticed details that drew their attention. The family's internal marriage patterns had remained consistent across several generations, and this raised an important question among medical historians. If such patterns existed for so long, what effect might they have had on the health of the family itself? The available evidence does not come from formal medical reports because those records remain largely private. Instead, researchers have relied on letters, diaries, and private correspondence written by family members and their associates. In some of these documents, historians have found references that suggest certain relatives struggled with what writers of the time described as nervous conditions or emotional instability. The language used in these letters was usually careful and indirect, which was typical of the period. 19th century writers rarely described mental illness openly, especially when discussing members of prominent families.
A 46-year-old woman named Jane Ashford. According to this, she had trouble and anxiety from the loss of several near relatives.
Another detail that has drawn attention is the way some individuals appear in family correspondence but are less visible in official genealogies or public accounts. A name might appear in a letter describing a relative's health or travel plans, yet that same person may not appear prominently in later family summaries. Historians cannot always determine the reason for these gaps, but they have noticed that the pattern appears in several different collections of correspondence. Understanding this pattern requires looking at how wealthy families handled sensitive personal matters during that era. Across Europe, aristocratic households placed enormous importance on reputation. Public image was closely connected to political influence and social standing. When a family member developed a serious illness, especially one involving mental health, relatives often preferred to manage the situation privately rather than expose it to public discussion. For this reason, wealthy families sometimes arranged for treatment in private clinics or quiet estates away from large cities. Doctors who worked with elite households were accustomed to maintaining strict confidentiality. Medical care could take place in secluded environments where patients were surrounded by family, staff, and trusted physicians rather than public institutions. These arrangements allowed families to provide treatment while also protecting their social standing. The Rothschild dynasty had greater resources than almost any other private family in Europe, which made this level of discretion even easier to maintain.
This is one of the foundations for the long-standing success of the Rothschild dynasty.
Their wealth allowed them to secure private medical care, arrange extended stays in secluded residences, and manage personal matters without attracting unwanted attention. As a result, any health challenges within the family could remain known only to a small circle of relatives and physicians. Because of this, scholars must rely on scattered clues found in letters, memoirs, and the occasional reference preserved in historical collections. But one member of the family would eventually bring this hidden issue closer to the public eye: the real genetic secret. For many years, speculation about the Rothschild family often focused on dramatic theories about hidden power or mysterious conspiracies. However, when historians and medical researchers began looking more closely at the available evidence, the story that emerged was very different. The Rothschild genetic history was not defined by visible physical deformities or shocking public scandals. Instead, the pattern that researchers gradually began to notice involved something quieter and far more complex. It concerned the possibility of hereditary vulnerability to certain psychiatric conditions within the family. One of the clearest documented examples involves a woman named Liberty Rothschild. She was born Elizabeth Charlotte Rothschild into one of the branches of the famous dynasty. Liberty grew up in an environment that valued education, science, and intellectual achievement. Members of the family were known for their interests in fields such as natural science, art collecting, and philanthropy. Her older sister, Miriam Rothschild, later became a respected naturalist and scientific researcher who published widely on zoology and genetics. Liberty's life, however, followed a different path. As she grew older, she began to experience symptoms that would later be identified as schizophrenia. This condition affects how a person thinks, feels, and perceives the world around them. At the time when Liberty was living, the understanding of psychiatric illness was far more limited than it is today, and families often handled such conditions privately rather than discussing them openly in public. Because the Rothschild family possessed enormous wealth and influence, they were able to support Liberty while keeping her life largely out of public attention. She did not become a public figure in the way that some of her relatives did. Instead, she lived quietly while receiving care and support within the protective structure of the family. Historical records about her life are limited, but the available accounts show that she remained surrounded by family members who ensured that she was cared for with dignity and stability. The significance of Liberty's story became clearer later through the actions of her sister Miriam Rothschild. Miriam was not only a member of one of Europe's most famous families, but also a serious scientist who worked extensively in fields such as parasitology and genetics. Through her research career, she became deeply interested in the biological mechanisms behind inherited traits. Motivated in part by her sister's experience, Miriam eventually founded a research initiative devoted to understanding schizophrenia. The creation of this research fund represented a quiet but meaningful shift in how the family approached the subject of hereditary mental illness. By supporting scientific research into the condition, Miriam acknowledged publicly that psychiatric disorders could have genetic components and deserved careful study rather than silence. For historians, this moment marked one of the first clear signals that hereditary mental health conditions existed within the Rothschild family, and that at least one member of the dynasty was willing to address the issue through scientific work. The decision to support research did not reveal every detail about the family's medical history, but it did demonstrate that the subject was real enough to warrant serious attention. Modern genetic research has since shown that when populations remain relatively closed over long periods of time, certain genetic traits can accumulate within the group. These traits are often complex and influenced by many different genes rather than a single inherited factor. Scientists studying family genetics have also observed that some hereditary traits can be connected to both exceptional intellectual ability and an increased susceptibility to certain mental health conditions. When historians look back at the Rothschild marriage strategy through the lens of modern genetics, they see a situation where a carefully managed family structure preserved wealth, influence, and cultural achievement across generations. At the same time, biology followed patterns that no system of social control could fully predict or manage. The family's darkest genetic secret was not the result of a hidden experiment or deliberate manipulation of heredity. Instead, it reflects a simple but powerful truth about human inheritance. Even the most powerful dynasty in Europe could not completely control the genetic traits passed from one generation to the next, and even today, many of the records that could fully explain this genetic history remain sealed. But if the full story is locked inside private archives, what do you think those sealed records might actually reveal? Let us know in the comments and subscribe to our channel for more.